The deadliest tsunami in Hawaii's history did not begin in the tropics, but thousands of miles away in one of the harshest, most remote places on Earth, the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. In the early morning hours of April 1st, 1946, at precisely 2:29 a.m. local time, the seafloor beneath the North Pacific ruptured with astonishing force. This was not an ordinary earthquake. Modern studies estimate it at a magnitude of 8.6, striking less than 10 miles beneath the ocean floor. What made it unusual was its type. It was a so-called tsunami earthquake, meaning the shaking felt on land was not as violently sharp as one might expect from such a large magnitude. Instead, the rupture involved a slow, massive heave of the seafloor, vertically thrusting water upwards in a way that was especially efficient at generating tsunamis. The rupture displaced the seafloor by as much as 40 feet in some places. That sudden movement acted like an enormous paddle slapping the Pacific Ocean, sending out a train of tsunami waves in every direction. Out in the deep ocean, these waves were nearly invisible, stretching over 100 miles from crest to crest and standing only a few feet tall. Ships at sea would have barely noticed them, perhaps only a gentle lift beneath their hulls. But while nearly imperceptible on the surface, the waves were moving at extraordinary speeds, racing outward at up to 500 miles per hour, the velocity of a modern jet aircraft. The first catastrophic proof of this tsunami's power came only minutes after the earthquake. On Unamok Island in Alaska, the 5-story Scotch Cap lighthouse, a reinforced concrete structure thought to be nearly indestructible, was obliterated. The wave that struck the station was later estimated to be more than 130 feet high. The tower and all 5 men stationed there were swept completely away, leaving nothing but fragments scattered across the coastline. That towering wall of water was only the beginning. The rest of the tsunami continued silently southward, across 2,400 miles of open ocean, carrying with it the energy of the Earth's violent convulsion. In its path lay Hawaii, completely unaware, with no system of warnings, no sirens, and no preparation for what was already on its way. By the time dawn broke on April 1st, 1946, Hawaii was carrying on with ordinary life. Radio stations filled the air with morning broadcasts, fishermen readied their boats, and school children made their way to class. There were no sirens, no bulletins, and no hint of the disaster rushing toward the islands. The journey of the tsunami from Alaska to Hawaii had taken just under 5 hours, but without a warning system, no one knew it was coming. At about 7 a.m., the first waves reached the Big Island's northeastern coast near Hilo. Witnesses later described how the ocean withdrew suddenly, exposing coral reefs and seafloor that were never seen dry. Moments later, the sea came roaring back. The initial surge was estimated to be more than 30 feet high, crashing inland with a force capable of uprooting massive trees and tossing cars like toys. Entire neighborhoods were engulfed in seconds. The devastation was worst in the town of Hilo, which faced the waves head-on. Wooden homes splintered into pieces, businesses were smashed apart, and rail lines were ripped from the ground. Some of the heaviest losses occurred at schools, where the timing of the waves coincided with children just arriving for their morning lessons. Buildings collapsed or were swept away, leaving chaos and fear in their wake. Elsewhere on the Big Island, plantations and small villages suffered immense destruction. In Laupaho'o, a wave surged deep into the valley, leaving behind shattered homes and scattered belongings. Survivors recalled the terrifying roar of the water, followed by silence, as entire families were lost to the sea. The waves did not stop with the Big Island. As the tsunami radiated outward, other islands were struck in succession. Maui, Oahu, and Kauai each endured surges that devastated low-lying coastal areas. Harbors were destroyed, boats were sunk or flung ashore, and bridges were washed away. Across the island chain, the tsunami left behind a trail of wreckage that stunned Hawaiians, who had never before experienced such a catastrophe. The people of Hawaii were left bewildered. No storm clouds had been seen, no winds had howled, and yet the sea had risen out of nowhere to destroy entire communities. What they could not yet know was that the waves they had just endured were part of one of the most destructive natural disasters ever recorded in the island's history. When the waves finally receded, the true scale of the tragedy began to emerge. Across Hawaii, the tsunami claimed the lives of more than 150 people, with the greatest number of deaths occurring on the Big Island. Hilo alone saw dozens of families torn apart and small coastal villages lost entire generations. The community of Laupaho'o was especially devastated. where 24 people, including schoolchildren and teachers, were killed when the wave swept through the school grounds. Many survivors described the experience as both sudden and surreal. Some were carried hundreds of feet inland by the water, clinging to the floating debris in desperate attempts to stay alive. Others managed to scramble to higher ground only to watch helplessly as their homes, workplaces, and loved ones disappeared beneath the churning sea. The stories of survival would later become part of the island's collective memory, passed down as solemn reminders of nature's power. The physical destruction was immense. Nearly every waterfront business in Hilo was destroyed, leaving the town's economy crippled. Sugar plantations, which were a backbone of Hawaii's economy at the time, lost large portions of their infrastructure as fields were drowned in salt water and equipment was washed away. Roads and bridges were destroyed, leaving some communities isolated for days before help could arrive. Relief efforts began almost immediately. The Red Cross, local churches, and volunteers worked to provide shelter and food for those left homeless. Military personnel stationed in Hawaii also assisted in search and rescue operations, using their equipment to clear debris and reopen access to coastal towns. Despite these efforts, many survivors faced weeks of hardship, living in makeshift shelters while struggling to rebuild their lives from the ruins. The psychological toll was equally severe. Families mourned lost loved ones, and children who survived the disaster carried lifelong trauma. Entire communities struggled with the haunting memory of a wave that had struck without warning. The suddenness of the event left many fearful of the ocean, a place that had always been central to Hawaiian life and culture. For Hawaii, the 1946 tsunami was not just a natural disaster, it was a turning point. It revealed how vulnerable the islands were to events that originated far across the Pacific, and it set the stage for major changes in how tsunamis would be studied and prepared for in the future. The devastation of the 1946 tsunami forced governments and scientists to confront a troubling reality. The Pacific Ocean had no coordinated system to detect or warn against tsunamis. Until then, waves were only understood after they arrived, leaving coastal communities defenseless. The disaster highlighted an urgent need for international cooperation, and Hawaii became the center of this effort. In 1949, just 3 years after the tragedy, the United States established the Seismic Sea Wave Warning System in Honolulu. This was the very first attempt at a structured tsunami warning network. Its mission was simple but ambitious: to detect earthquakes across the Pacific and issue alerts if those quakes were strong enough to generate dangerous waves. The system relied on seismic monitoring stations scattered throughout the region, along with tide gauges that recorded changes in sea level. Messages were relayed by telegraph and telephone, technology that seems primitive by today's standards, but was groundbreaking at the time. If an undersea earthquake occurred, data would be analyzed in Honolulu, and warnings could then be broadcast to at-risk communities in Hawaii and beyond. This marked the beginning of what would eventually evolve into the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center. Over the years, the system grew to include dozens of member nations, stretching across Asia, the Americas, and Oceania. By sharing data internationally, scientists could track tsunamis more accurately and warn coastal populations hours before waves made landfall. The creation of this system was not just a scientific achievement, but a response to human suffering. Policymakers and scientists alike understood that the lives lost in 1946 could not be brought back, but future disasters could be mitigated. The warning system gave coastal communities a fighting chance, turning an unexpected tragedy into a catalyst for progress. For Hawaii, this new level of preparedness became part of daily life. Residents began taking sirens, drills, and evacuation routes seriously, knowing all too well that tsunamis were not just distant possibilities, but real threats that could strike at any time. In the decades following the 1946 tsunami science underwent a remarkable transformation. Early warning systems that once relied only on seismographs and tide gauges began to incorporate advanced technologies that could detect and track waves across the entire Pacific Ocean. By the 1960s, computers allowed scientists to model wave behavior, helping them predict how tsunamis might travel after an undersea earthquake. A turning point came in the 1990s with the development of the Deep Ocean Assessment and a Reporting of Tsunamis system, better known as DART buoys. These specialized instruments, anchored to the seafloor and connected to surface buoys, could measure minute changes in water pressure as a tsunami passed by. The information was transmitted in real time by satellite, giving scientists precise data on wave height, speed, and direction. Satellites also played a vital role in expanding global awareness of tsunamis. They provided rapid communication channels and enabled detailed observation of the ocean's surface. Combined with seismographic networks, these tools allowed scientists not only to detect tsunamis more quickly, but also to issue warnings to nations far beyond the Pacific. Hawaii's role in this global effort remained central. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center in Honolulu continued to expand, offering alerts not only to the islands, but also to dozens of countries across the Pacific Rim. Today, its warnings are distributed within minutes of a major undersea earthquake, a speed unthinkable in the 1940s. What makes these technological advancements even more significant is their life-saving potential. While natural disasters cannot be stopped, accurate detection and rapid communication can drastically reduce casualties. Communities now receive evacuation alerts through sirens, radios, and even smartphone notifications, tools that did not exist when the deadly waves of 1946 struck without warning. The evolution of tsunami science shows how far humanity has come since that fateful April morning. It reflects a blend of scientific innovation, international cooperation, and lessons learned the hard way. Each improvement, from seafloor sensors to satellite imaging, stands as a direct response to the tragedy that devastated Hawaii in 1946. The 1946 tsunami left scars on Hawaii that were both physical and cultural. Entire shorelines were reshaped, and many coastal communities had to rebuild from nothing. Yet, beyond the destruction, the event became a defining moment in the island's collective memory. Stories of survival, loss, and resilience were passed down through families, ensuring that the lessons of that day would never be forgotten. Schools across Hawaii eventually began incorporating tsunami education into their programs, teaching children evacuation routes and the importance of seeking higher ground. Sirens were installed along beaches and towns, becoming a familiar part of life on the islands. For residents, the sound of those sirens served not only as a warning system, but also as a reminder of the tragedy that claimed lives decades earlier. Memorials were created to honor those who were lost, particularly in the hardest hit areas of Hilo and Laupahoehoe. These quiet places of remembrance connect today's communities to the experiences of those who endured the waves in April of 1946. Each ceremony held there reinforces the importance of vigilance in the face of natural disasters. Globally, the disaster influenced how nations prepared for tsunamis. It highlighted the need for cooperation between countries sharing the Pacific Ocean, eventually leading to international warning networks that now safeguard millions of people. The memory of what happened in Hawaii played a major role in shaping that system. Today, the 1946 tsunami is remembered not only as one of the deadliest natural disasters in Hawaii's history, but also as the catalyst for life-saving advancements. The lessons learned from that day continue to guide preparedness efforts around the world, reminding us that while the ocean brings life and beauty, it also carries unimaginable power. The story of the 1946 tsunami ultimately stands as both a warning and a testament to resilience. It reminds us that vigilance, preparation, and respect for nature are the best defenses against forces far beyond human control. On the Burin Peninsula of Newfoundland in the autumn of 1929, life followed a rhythm dictated by the North Atlantic. Small, isolated fishing outports clung to the southern coast, with no paved roads linking them to the rest of the island. Communication with the outside world relied on a single telegraph line and the weekly coastal steamer. Families spent their days fishing, curing cod on wooden stages, and preparing for the harsh winter ahead. The communities were hardy, accustomed to storms and the relentless sea, but nothing in their experience could have prepared them for what was coming. Monday, November 18th, began as a calm, clear day. A recent storm had knocked down parts of the local telegraph wire, but by evening the sea appeared placid. Families gathered in their homes, the aroma of cooking filling the air. 5-year-old Gus Etchegary was in St. Lawrence, his sisters busy at the stove, when the calm seemed to settle over the peninsula. Far beneath the ocean, roughly 250 kilometers south of the Burin Peninsula, lay the Laurentian Slope. This steep continental shelf drops from depths of around 100 meters to more than 2,000 meters, a geologically unstable zone where pressure accumulates over centuries. In 1929, the concept of plate tectonics was not understood by the locals, and earthquakes in the North Atlantic were considered improbable. The ground beneath their feet had always seemed solid. and no one imagined that the Atlantic seafloor could suddenly awaken with catastrophic force. As the evening wore on, the people of the peninsula went about their routines, unaware that a massive tectonic event was already unfolding beneath the waves. The calm of the coast belied the coming disaster, setting the stage for a night that would forever alter Newfoundland's history. At 5:02 p.m. Newfoundland time on November 18, 1929, the calm was shattered. A powerful earthquake, later measured at magnitude 7.2, struck deep beneath the Atlantic Ocean. On the Burin Peninsula, the tremors lasted for approximately 5 minutes. Dishes rattled, lamps swayed, and chimneys developed cracks or toppled entirely. Families rushed outdoors, confused and alarmed, unsure whether a boiler had exploded or some unimaginable catastrophe had begun. In St. Lawrence, young Gus Etchegaray watched the plate of potatoes on the stove vibrate violently, the household gripped by a mix of fear and disbelief. Though the shaking subsided without catastrophic damage on land, the true disaster was occurring beneath the waves. The seismic event triggered a massive underwater landslide on the continental slope of the Grand Banks. An estimated 200 cubic kilometers of sediment began tumbling down the steep slope, accelerating as it descended into deeper waters. This enormous displacement of Earth created a turbidity current, a fast-moving dense flow of sediment and water, traveling at speeds up to 100 kilometers per hour. The underwater avalanche struck 12 transatlantic telegraph cables connecting North America to Europe. Each snapped in sequence from north to south, providing scientists decades later with the first definitive evidence of high-speed submarine landslides. For the people of Newfoundland, the effect was immediate and isolating. The island was suddenly cut off from the rest of the world, communications silenced in an instant. As night fell, no one on the peninsula realized that the tremor was only the opening act. The Atlantic had begun its lethal response, building toward a wave that would soon rise to unprecedented heights, reshaping the coastline and the lives of those who called it home. By 7:30 p.m. Newfoundland time, more than 2 hours after the initial tremor, something unusual began to appear along the shoreline. The water in harbors and coves started to recede at an unnatural speed, exposing the seabed in areas normally hidden beneath the Atlantic. Anchored boats and schooners were left tilting awkwardly in the mud, their hulls scraping against the newly revealed ocean floor. For many residents, curiosity overcame caution, and they ventured closer to observe the strange phenomenon, unaware that it was a classic warning sign of an approaching tsunami. Within minutes, the first giant wave struck. Unlike a single surge, the tsunami arrived in 3 successive pulses. In deep water, the waves traveled at speeds approaching 140 kilometers per hour, slowing to about 40 kilometers per hour as they reached the shallower coastline. The height of the water along the open coast ranged from 2 to 7 meters, but the funnel-shaped inlets of the Burin Peninsula amplified the surge. At Port au Bras, the wave reached approximately 13 meters over 40 feet, devastating homes and infrastructure in its path. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. Wooden houses were lifted from their foundations and smashed, fishing stages and wharves were obliterated, and schooners were carried inland. Entire livelihoods, including more than 280,000 pounds of preserved cod, were swept away. In Lord's Cove, the Rennie family witnessed the destruction firsthand. 4 young children and their mother were swept away, with only the 3-year-old daughter surviving the deluge. 28 lives were lost in total, making this the deadliest earthquake-related tsunami in recorded Canadian history. The night was filled with chaos, confusion, and freezing Atlantic waters. Survivors fled to higher ground, watching as the relentless sea consumed everything in its path. The Burin Peninsula had been permanently changed, its communities scarred, and its residents faced with unimaginable loss. Within half an hour of the final wave, the water began to recede, leaving a coastline that was almost unrecognizable. Entire villages were reduced to splintered wood, overturned boats, and debris scattered across the shore. Survivors emerged from hiding to confront a landscape of utter devastation, the cold November air cutting through soaked clothing. Property losses were immense, estimated at over $1 million Canadian dollars in 1929, a staggering sum for the already struggling island economy. The tsunami had also severed vital connections to the outside world. The recent earthquake and underwater landslide had destroyed telegraph lines and cables, leaving the Burin Peninsula completely isolated. No messages could be sent, and news of the disaster would take days to reach St. John's or other regions. As if the destruction were not enough, a severe winter blizzard struck the peninsula the following day, burying homes, wreckage, and survivors alike under heavy snow. Rescue and relief were slow to arrive, but the SS Meagle reached the area nearly 3 days later, bringing doctors, nurses, and much-needed supplies. Aid from the Red Cross, local authorities, and international governments soon followed, but rebuilding would take years. Many families lost not only homes but entire means of livelihood, as the cod fishery infrastructure had been destroyed. Some residents, like Patrick Rennie of Lord's Cove, were forced to seek work in newly opened fluorspar mines, trading the perils of the sea for those of mining life. The disaster became a turning point for science as well. The sequential snapping of transatlantic telegraph cables provided the first concrete evidence of high-speed turbidity currents, helping researchers understand submarine landslides and underwater earthquakes. Modern Devastation tsunami risk assessments and warning systems would eventually be influenced by these events, highlighting the enduring scientific legacy of the 1929 disaster. The 1929 Newfoundland earthquake and tsunami left an indelible mark on both the landscape and the people of the Burin Peninsula. Entire communities were permanently altered, and many families never returned to their pre-disaster homes. Oral histories passed down through generations preserve stories of survival, tragedy, and heroism, ensuring that the events would never be forgotten. For the scientific community, the disaster provided a rare opportunity to study the interplay between underwater earthquakes, landslides, and tsunamis in the North Atlantic. The damage to 12 transatlantic telegraph cables offered precise timing of underwater sediment movement, giving researchers critical insights into turbidity currents and their destructive potential. These findings would influence submarine geology, seismology, and tsunami prediction for decades. The economic impact was profound. Fishing infrastructure, including wharves, stages, and flakes, had been destroyed, and the loss of over 280,000 pounds of salt cod represented a major blow to the region's primary industry. Rebuilding required immense effort, and some communities never fully recovered, reshaping settlement patterns on the southern coast of Newfoundland. Emergency response and disaster preparedness also evolved as a result. Local and national authorities learned the importance of rapid communication, resilient infrastructure, and early warning systems, laying the groundwork for future safety measures. The 1929 event highlighted both human vulnerability and resilience in the face of natural disasters. Today, memorials along the Burin Peninsula mark the sites of homes lost and lives claimed, honoring those who perished. The story of the earthquake and tsunami serves as a sobering reminder of nature's unpredictability and power. It also stands as a testament to human endurance, adaptation, and the capacity to rebuild in the wake of unimaginable tragedy. Newfoundland's 1929 tsunami remains a pivotal moment in Canadian history, teaching lessons in science, preparedness, and the enduring spirit of coastal communities. It was the morning of October 11th, 1918, on the tropical island of Puerto Rico. The sun rose over the hills, casting golden light across towns brimming with life. Along the western coast, the smell of salt hung in the air, and waves lapped gently at the shores. Fishermen prepared their boats for a day at sea, children played in cobblestone streets, and shops opened their doors for business as usual. No one could have guessed that beneath the waters of the Mona Passage, immense geological forces were building pressure that had accumulated for centuries. At precisely 10:14 in the morning, that pressure was about to erupt. Without warning, the ground shook violently, signaling the start of what would become the San Fermín earthquake. Residents would have only moments to realize that this was not merely the earth trembling beneath them, but the beginning of a disaster that would combine the fury of both land and sea. At 10:14 in the morning on October 11th, 1918, Puerto Rico was struck by a magnitude 7.1 earthquake with its epicenter just off the northwestern coast. The ground rolled violently, sending shockwaves through towns and farmland. In Aguadilla, the quake reached a level 9 on the Mercalli intensity scale, causing severe damage to brick buildings and industrial structures. Mayaguez, the largest city on the west coast, suffered heavily as roughly 700 masonry buildings were either destroyed or badly damaged. Landmarks like the municipal theater, schools, and the post office crumbled, while chimneys of sugar mills snapped under the shaking. Bridges twisted and fell into rivers, cutting off vital transport routes. Eyewitnesses described the ground moving like waves across soft farmland, a terrifying ripple that made the earth itself seem alive. In these moments, it became clear that this earthquake was not a minor tremor, but a disaster capable of reshaping the landscape and overwhelming communities. Minutes after the earthquake struck, a deceptive calm settled over Puerto Rico's northwestern coastline. But this was only the prelude to a far deadlier threat. Residents along the shorelines of Aguadilla, Rincon, and Mayagüez noticed a phenomenon that defied comprehension. The ocean began to recede at an alarming speed. In Aguadilla Bay, water drained from the harbor so quickly that boats were left awkwardly sitting on the exposed seabed, and coral reefs, normally hidden beneath the waves, were revealed in full detail. The retreat of the sea exposed areas that had never been seen by human eyes, leaving fish stranded and flapping helplessly, a harrowing warning of the disaster to come. This unnatural withdrawal lasted for approximately 4 to 7 minutes, yet it was long enough for many curious residents to step onto the temporarily exposed ocean floor, unaware of the danger looming. Local accounts indicate that a lighthouse keeper at Punta Brinquen observed the water pulling back while the earthquake was still ongoing, highlighting how quickly the event escalated. Scientists today understand that this sudden retreat was caused by the displacement of water from the seafloor as the tectonic plates abruptly shifted along the Mona Rift. This withdrawal was essentially the inhale of the tsunami, signaling the immense force preparing to strike. As the sea receded, debris from previous storms, floating logs, and small fishing vessels became trapped and tangled, making the exposed seabed a chaotic landscape of destruction. In towns like Mayagüez, the initial withdrawal caused confusion and awe, with residents observing the ocean's raw power without realizing the deadly wall of water would return moments later. The eerie calm created a false sense of security, emphasizing the deceptive nature of tsunamis. This moment between the earthquake and the tsunami was crucial in understanding the rapid sequence of the disaster. The earthquake itself had already weakened buildings, snapped chimneys, and cracked bridges, leaving communities highly vulnerable. The retreating sea was not just a spectacle, it was the ocean gathering its full destructive potential. Within minutes, the coast would witness the unimaginable force of nature, a towering wave ready to erase everything in its path. By the time the first surge hit Punta Aguirreada, the wave had already grown to over 20 feet high, equivalent to a 2-story building, demonstrating how even minor delays in recognizing the danger could prove fatal. Smaller bays and inlets along the coast amplified the wave height due to their funnel-like shapes, making some locations more vulnerable than others. The timing, speed, and force of the tsunami were dictated entirely by the energy released from the sudden vertical displacement of the seabed, and the residents had no warning system to prepare them. This terrifying moment illustrates the raw unpredictability of natural disasters. While the earthquake had already caused widespread damage, it was the silent approach of the sea, hidden in plain sight, that would deliver the most devastating blow. Coastal Puerto Rico was about to experience the full fury of a tsunami that would reshape communities, claim lives, and leave a permanent scar on the landscape. The withdrawing sea and the first tsunami surge set the stage for a disaster that would test the resilience of every person along the coast. Understanding this sequence helps modern scientists model tsunami behavior more accurately, but for those living through October 11, 1918, it was a lesson in terror with no chance for preparation. When the tsunami finally struck, the coastal towns of western Puerto Rico were transformed into scenes of utter devastation. Aguadilla, located closest to the epicenter, was hit by the initial surge of water that reached over 20 feet in height, obliterating around 300 small beach huts in moments. The force of the wave dragged debris, boats, and even larger structures into the water, creating a deadly, chaotic mix that swept through streets and alleys. In total, approximately 32 residents of Aguadilla lost their lives, their homes and livelihoods erased in minutes. Further south in Mayagüez, the tsunami arrived roughly 20 minutes after the earthquake, with waves around 5 feet high. While smaller, this surge was still strong enough to flood streets, overturn buildings, and drag houses from their foundations into the bay. Cemeteries were not spared, tombs and mausoleums were damaged, and coffins were displaced, leaving a tragic imprint on the historical record. The economic cost was significant, estimated between $4 and $29 million, equivalent to doubling the island's annual budget at the time. Sugar mills, warehouses, and essential infrastructure along the west coast were extensively damaged, and the agricultural sector suffered from flooded fields and destroyed irrigation systems. The earthquake and tsunami together caused widespread structural collapse. Brick buildings, poorly reinforced for seismic activity, crumbled entirely, while wooden structures were torn from their foundations. Chimneys toppled, bridges buckled, and roads were washed out, effectively isolating many towns from immediate relief. The undersea telegraph cables connecting Puerto Rico to the outside world were severed, cutting off communication and leaving the island reliant on internal coordination for emergency response. Thousands of residents were forced to flee unstable buildings and seek refuge in hills or open fields, creating makeshift encampments that persisted for weeks. Fires broke out in several cities due to broken gas lines and damaged electrical systems, compounding the destruction and slowing recovery efforts. Historical accounts from survivors, preserved in letters and petitions to the government, documented the personal devastation of losing homes, businesses, and public facilities. These records now provide modern researchers with precise data on the tsunami's path and the distribution of damage, confirming which areas were most affected and which locations slightly elevated were spared. The aftermath also exposed the vulnerability of the island to dual natural hazards. Earthquake followed immediately by tsunami. It became evident that reconstruction would need to consider both seismic safety and coastal flood protection, lessons that would influence building practices in Puerto Rico for decades. Beyond the physical damage, the psychological impact was immense, with survivors enduring trauma and the fear of aftershocks and future tsunamis. The western coast was a land marked by ruin, the quiet after the disaster a haunting reminder of the power of nature unleashed. Even after the immediate devastation, the terror of the 1918 San Fermín earthquake and tsunami was far from over. Residents of western Puerto Rico faced relentless aftershocks, some strong enough to cause additional damage, lasting for up to 9 months after the main earthquake on October 11th. These tremors prevented full recovery, as weakened buildings were constantly at risk of collapse, forcing many to remain in temporary shelters or open fields. On October 24th, a notable aftershock rattled the region again, followed by another on November 12th, reinforcing the sense that the land itself was unpredictable and untrustworthy. The long-term psychological impact on survivors was severe. Constant anxiety, fear of returning to their homes, and sleepless nights were common, as even minor vibrations brought memories of the disaster rushing back. Communities struggled to maintain basic services, with roads, bridges, and telecommunication systems destroyed or severely disrupted. Recovery efforts were further complicated by the lack of immediate external aid due to the severed undersea telegraph cables, forcing towns to rely heavily on local coordination and resourcefulness. From a scientific perspective, the 1918 disaster has provided invaluable lessons in understanding earthquake and tsunami dynamics in the Caribbean. Modern research confirms that the tsunami was caused directly by the rupture of multiple fault segments along the Mona Rift rather than by a recent underwater landslide, correcting century-old misconceptions. Radiocarbon dating of the seafloor sediment confirmed that the previously suspected landslide was centuries old, highlighting the importance of careful geological analysis. Scientists today use the detailed survivor records and damage maps from the event to model tsunami propagation and earthquake impacts, informing contemporary emergency preparedness strategies in Puerto Rico and other seismically active regions. The event led to the development of more stringent building codes and disaster preparedness measures, particularly for coastal communities exposed to both seismic and tsunami hazards. Awareness campaigns, evacuation drills, and early warning research now owe a debt to the lessons learned from October 11, 1918. The 116 lives lost, combined with the destruction of homes, businesses, and infrastructure, serve as a somber benchmark for assessing risk in the region. Ultimately, the San Fermín earthquake and tsunami reshaped Puerto Rico physically, socially, and scientifically. It underscored the unpredictability of natural forces and the importance of preparedness, while also leaving a lasting legacy in the collective memory of the island. Today, the story of October 11, 1918, remains a powerful reminder of the need to respect the power of the earth and the sea, and to plan for events that can strike without warning, forever changing the lives of those in their path. On March 11, 2011, Japan experienced one of the most devastating natural disasters in its history, the Tohoku earthquake. Measuring a staggering 9.0 on the Richter scale, this earthquake was the strongest ever recorded in Japan. It struck off the eastern coast deep under the Pacific Ocean, with the epicenter located about 70 miles east of the city of Sendai. The massive quake occurred at around 2:46 p.m. local time and lasted for several minutes, shaking the entire island of Honshu. The tremors from the earthquake were felt across the country, with buildings swaying in the capital, Tokyo, and the surrounding areas. But the earthquake wasn't just a terrifying moment for the people of Japan, it set off a chain of catastrophic events. The shaking of the earth caused enormous damage, and the ground itself was displaced. In fact, the Tohoku earthquake was so powerful that it caused the island of Honshu to shift eastward by about 8 feet. The land movement was so intense that it even affected the Earth's rotation, shortening the length of a day by a fraction of a second. The immediate destruction caused by the earthquake was overwhelming. Buildings collapsed, roads cracked open, and entire communities were left in ruins. Infrastructure was severely damaged, including railways, bridges, and power lines, leaving many areas without electricity, water, and communication. But as if the earthquake itself wasn't enough, it triggered something even more destructive: the tsunami. Within minutes of the earthquake, the sea began to rise. Waves, some reaching heights of up to 130 feet, surged across the coastline. The tsunami slammed into the eastern shores of Japan, moving at speeds of up to 500 miles per hour, faster than a commercial jet. Entire towns and villages were swept away in seconds, as the relentless force of the ocean drowned homes, vehicles, and buildings. It wasn't just the size of the waves that caused the destruction, it was the sheer speed and power behind them. Entire neighborhoods were wiped off the map, and the death toll began to rise rapidly. In addition to the overwhelming destruction, the tsunami also caused a massive environmental impact. The powerful waves flooded fields, forests, and rivers, turning once thriving ecosystems into disaster zones. The aftermath left behind a landscape of devastation, and the cleanup and recovery efforts would take years. Even more alarming was the damage to the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. The tsunami crippled the facility, knocking out backup generators and leading to meltdowns in several reactors. This sparked an international nuclear crisis as the world watched in horror, unsure of how far the contamination would spread. The scale of the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami left the country reeling. It wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a life-altering event that shook the very foundation of Japan. Survivors would soon face unimaginable challenges as they dealt with the immediate aftermath. The destruction was just the beginning. The first few hours after the Tohoku earthquake were filled with chaos and confusion. As aftershocks continued to rattle the country, it quickly became clear that the scale of the destruction was far worse than anyone had anticipated. Communication lines were down, and power outages affected millions. Many people found themselves trapped under rubble, while others scrambled to find shelter and basic necessities. Rescue operations were immediately put into action, but the damage was so widespread that it was difficult to know where to start. In the hardest hit areas, such as Sendai and other towns in the northeast, entire neighborhoods had been wiped out by the tsunami. In some cases, there was nothing left but a sea of debris. Families had lost homes, loved ones, and their entire livelihoods in a matter of hours. Emergency response teams, both local and international, faced incredible challenges in trying to locate survivors, often working in unsafe and difficult conditions. The destruction of roads, bridges, and airports made it nearly impossible to reach the worst affected areas quickly, and search and rescue teams had to rely on boats and helicopters to carry out their operations. The devastation also left the Japanese government scrambling to coordinate efforts on a massive scale. Within the first day, it became clear that the damage was beyond what anyone had imagined. The focus shifted from immediate rescue to managing the crisis and beginning the recovery process. Thousands of people were displaced, living in temporary shelters, with limited access to food, water, and medical care. The government quickly declared a state of emergency and sent troops and aid workers to help with the relief efforts. Meanwhile, the tsunami's impact was still unfolding. The relentless surge of water had left thousands of people stranded, especially in coastal towns and fishing villages, where the waves had come in so fast that there was no time for evacuation. In some places, the water had pushed inland for miles, leaving behind flooded fields, destroyed homes, and overturned cars. Survivors were left to pick up the pieces of their lives, but many didn't know where to begin. The loss of life was unimaginable, and the trauma of seeing everything they knew and loved swept away was overwhelming. As the death toll continued to climb, there was a desperate need for medical care. Hospitals were inundated with injured patients, and doctors and nurses worked tirelessly. Despite the overwhelming number of casualties, many hospitals were also affected by the earthquake and tsunami, and some had to relocate or operate under extremely difficult circumstances. The shortage of medical supplies was another hurdle, with medical teams relying on emergency stockpiles and aid from the international community to treat the injured. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster was also an escalating crisis that added to the complexity of the situation. As the plant's reactors overheated, a radioactive leak began to contaminate the air, water, and soil around the facility. The government had to quickly evacuate people within a 12-mile radius of the plant, and there were growing concerns about the long-term effects of radiation exposure. The threat of contamination extended beyond Japan's borders, with neighboring countries and the global community watching closely as the situation developed. The disaster sparked a renewed debate about the safety of nuclear power and whether Japan's reliance on nuclear energy was sustainable in such a disaster-prone region. In the aftermath of the earthquake and tsunami, Japan's disaster preparedness was put to the ultimate test. The country had always been well known for its building standards and readiness for natural disasters, but this catastrophe showed that no level of preparation could fully anticipate the scale of such a destructive event. While Japan's response was swift, the scale of the disaster was so large that it overwhelmed even the best-laid plans. It was clear that the nation was going to need all the help it could get from the international community to recover. As the days turned into weeks after the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, the challenges facing Japan only grew more complex. The immediate aftermath had seen some rescue operations begin to yield positive results, but now the focus had shifted to the long-term effects of the disaster and the grueling task of rebuilding. With over 15,000 lives lost and many more still missing, the country was beginning to grapple with the full extent of the tragedy. Whole towns had been completely wiped off the map, and the sheer scale of the damage seemed impossible to comprehend. The tsunami had swept through coastal towns with such force that entire communities were gone in an instant. In many of these places, there was nothing left but debris and wreckage, and people were left wondering how they could rebuild their lives when everything had been lost. Temporary shelters had been set up across the country, but with millions displaced, it became apparent that Japan was facing a logistical nightmare in terms of providing adequate shelter, food, water, and medical care. The number of survivors was still being assessed, and many had been forced to live in makeshift shelters with no idea when or if they could return home. In addition to the physical destruction, the emotional toll on survivors was immeasurable. Communities were left to cope with the loss of loved ones, friends, and neighbors. For many, the trauma of the event was compounded by the uncertainty about their future. People were desperate for information about where they could go, how they could find their missing family members, and what would become of the homes and businesses that had once been their livelihoods. The recovery process was hindered by continued aftershocks and the ever-present risk of further seismic activity. Even as efforts were made to stabilize the situation and restore order, Japan's infrastructure remained under immense strain. Roads, railways, and airports had been severely damaged, making it difficult to transport aid to those in need. The logistical challenges of rebuilding were further compounded by the fact that many affected areas were in remote locations, requiring teams to work in hazardous conditions to begin the process of clearing debris and making the land safe again. Meanwhile, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear crisis was escalating. The plant's reactors were still overheating, and the threat of a nuclear meltdown loomed large. Over the weeks that followed, the Japanese government had to continue evacuating residents from the surrounding areas as it worked to bring the reactors under control. The public's fear and uncertainty about the long-term health effects of radiation exposure was palpable, as people struggled to comprehend the full impact of the crisis. International organizations and experts closely monitored the situation as the global community watched to see if the situation could be contained. The environmental impact of the disaster was far-reaching as well. Coastal ecosystems had been decimated by the powerful waves, and the destruction of habitats had long-term consequences for marine life. In some areas, the destruction was so severe that efforts to restore the environment would take years, if not decades. The contamination of water supplies also raised concerns about the long-term health risks to both humans and wildlife. In the midst of all this destruction, the spirit of resilience and cooperation in Japan became evident. Communities that had been torn apart by the disaster began to come together to support each other. Volunteers from across the country, as well as from other nations, arrived to help with the recovery efforts. Though the task ahead seemed impossible, people were determined to rebuild and move forward. While the physical and emotional scars left by the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami would remain for years to come, Japan's strength and resolve were visible in the faces of those who were working tirelessly to help each other and rebuild their communities. The government, too, was working around the clock to address the needs of the people and coordinate efforts with international organizations. Aid was being funneled into the hardest hit areas, and as the weeks passed, there was a glimmer of hope that recovery would one day be possible, even if the road ahead was long and uncertain. Despite all the devastation, Japan's ability to unite and push forward in the face of unimaginable loss was truly remarkable. Months passed after the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, and Japan's recovery began to take shape, though the process was slow and fraught with challenges. As the immediate crisis started to settle, the true scope of the disaster's long-term effects on the country's infrastructure, economy, and society became more apparent. Reconstruction was an overwhelming task, but the people of Japan, known for their resilience, were not backing down. The nation was determined to rise from the ashes of the catastrophe and rebuild stronger than before, but it would take time. The scale of the destruction continued to unfold as teams of engineers, construction workers, and volunteers worked tirelessly to rebuild roads, homes, schools, and businesses. However, much of Japan's infrastructure had been completely wiped out, leaving vast areas uninhabitable. Some towns, once thriving communities, were now ghost towns. Many citizens faced the harsh reality that their homes were gone and they had nowhere to return to. For those who had been displaced, living in temporary shelters for months became a way of life. Even with the help of international aid and volunteers, the sheer amount of debris that needed to be cleared was staggering. Heavy machinery worked day and night to make roads passable again, while thousands of tons of wreckage were removed from the affected areas. One of the greatest challenges in the recovery process was the nuclear disaster at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. While the earthquake and tsunami had caused widespread damage, the nuclear crisis had the potential for far-reaching consequences. The plant had suffered catastrophic damage, and the reactors had begun leaking radiation. Despite efforts by plant workers to prevent a full meltdown, the situation remained tense for months after the disaster. Thousands of residents in the area had been evacuated, with no clear idea of when they could safely return home. The radioactive contamination was a real threat, and the Japanese government faced enormous pressure to contain the disaster. Over time, efforts to stabilize the reactors progressed, but the impact of the meltdown on both the environment and public health was only beginning to be understood. As time went on, the economic fallout from the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami also became more pronounced. The damage to Japan's industrial sector was severe, and the country faced significant losses in its manufacturing industries. Many factories, especially those in the hardest hit regions, had to shut down indefinitely. Even industries outside the immediate impact zone felt the repercussions as disruptions to the supply chain caused by the disaster spread throughout the country. The nation's economy had already been fragile due to prior challenges, and the earthquake and tsunami added another layer of strain. It was clear that recovery wouldn't just be about rebuilding homes and businesses. It would also require significant effort to revitalize the economy and restore livelihoods. The environmental impact was another lingering concern. In addition to the devastation caused by the tsunami, the contamination of soil and water from the Fukushima nuclear disaster posed significant challenges for agriculture and fishing industries. Farmers in affected areas faced crop failures due to the destruction of land and the spread of radioactive material. Fishers, too, found their livelihoods threatened as radiation-tainted waters affected the fishing industry. Many coastal towns had to halt their fishing activities for months, and restoring the health of marine ecosystems would take years. The environmental recovery process was a slow one, requiring efforts to clean up contaminated areas and ensure that people could return to a healthy, sustainable way of life. Though the immediate aftermath of the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami was devastating, Japan began to heal over time. The global community continued to offer support, and international organizations worked closely with the Japanese government to provide aid and expertise in the recovery efforts. The emotional toll on survivors, however, was deep. Many had lost loved ones, homes, and entire communities, and the process of healing was just beginning. Mental health support became a critical aspect of the recovery efforts, with survivors being encouraged to seek counseling and community support to cope with the trauma they had experienced. Japan's commitment to its recovery was unwavering. Over the months, as rebuilding efforts gained momentum, the country's sense of unity and resilience became even more apparent. Communities that had once been torn apart were now coming together to support each other. Volunteers continued to arrive from across Japan and beyond, offering assistance in every form imaginable. Despite the long road ahead, Japan had taken its first steps toward recovery, and the people showed the world that their spirit would not be broken by even the most devastating of disasters. As the years went on, the recovery from the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami continued. Though the scars of that fateful day would remain for a long time, the physical destruction caused by the disaster was gradually repaired. But the emotional and psychological toll it took on Japan's citizens was something that could not be rebuilt in the same way. Survivors were left with memories of loss and fear, memories that would linger long after the debris was cleared. For many, the recovery process became about more than just rebuilding homes or cities. It was about rebuilding lives. In the aftermath, Japan made important strides in disaster preparedness and safety. The Tohoku earthquake and tsunami were grim reminders of the vulnerabilities the country faced, and the nation took these lessons seriously. Japan implemented stricter building codes and disaster response protocols, ensuring that future generations would be better prepared to handle any kind of natural disaster. Early warning systems were improved, and emergency drills became more frequent, with both citizens and officials learning how to respond more effectively in times of crisis. Internationally, the Tohoku disaster prompted a re-evaluation of nuclear energy and its safety. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster led to a widespread reassessment of nuclear power plants around the world, and many countries began to reconsider their reliance on nuclear energy. Japan, too, faced tough decisions regarding its nuclear future. While some reactors were shut down, the country made efforts to shift towards renewable energy sources in a bid to reduce its dependence on nuclear power and fossil fuels. The global conversation about the risks and benefits of nuclear energy became more urgent, and many nations reconsidered their energy strategies as a result. The environmental recovery from the Tohoku disaster was a long and difficult process. The Fukushima nuclear disaster had left a lasting mark on Japan's landscape, with certain areas remaining uninhabitable due to radiation contamination. While the cleanup efforts were ongoing, the country's commitment to restoring its environment remained steadfast. Local ecosystems, especially in coastal areas, began to show signs of recovery, though some species of marine life still face challenges due to the contamination. Over time, efforts to restore damaged ecosystems and promote sustainable practices gained momentum. The emotional impact of the disaster also left a profound mark on Japan's culture and psyche. Families who had lost loved ones found solace in their shared experiences, and many people felt a renewed sense of community as they came together to help each other. The disaster had brought out the best in people, with volunteers from around Japan and the world coming to support those in need. Despite the immense pain, the Japanese people demonstrated extraordinary resilience, showing the world that even in the face of such overwhelming loss, hope could still flourish. In the end, the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami served as a reminder of nature's immense power and the importance of preparation. The disaster tested Japan's strength, but it also highlighted the unbreakable spirit of its people. While the immediate impact of the disaster was devastating, the response to it revealed a nation committed to learning from tragedy and building a more resilient future. Though the wounds from that day may never fully heal, Japan's recovery demonstrated the strength of human perseverance and the power of unity in the face of disaster.